What is your first memory? What is the first thing that you remember about yourself? When was the first time that you remember yourself as yourself? If you were me, your first memory would be of a mound of flesh, soft and dark, and you would remember suckling on it and smelling sweat and tasting salt. And you would remember this amazing feeling of connectedness, of being part of a whole, of belonging. And you would remember being put down and reaching out that hand, your hand, to feel that connectedness again, and realizing that your own skin is so light, while the skin of that woman who you were so connected to only a second ago is so dark. That woman would be your grandmother, because your parents had you when they were 16 and couldn't take care of you. So they sent you to live in a farm in the rural Philippine landscape of Bulacan. And over time, you begin losing that sense of connectedness and belonging because you are the only light-skinned, blonde-haired person for miles around. You, an albino kid in this rural part of the Philippines, and wherever you go, wherever you went, you would be pointed at, and people would say, anak araw, which means child of the sun. And you wouldn't feel as though you were part of any community, this community. And over time, that takes over your psychology and your soul, and you internalize it. And without even knowing it, you make certain decisions about yourself. You don't have the choice to be normal. You don't have the choice to belong. So your options are either to feel as though you're an error, an abomination, that you don't belong in the world, that you're a freak of nature, or you can choose to think of yourself as unique, as special, as one of a kind, and you begin to develop this way. And one of the earliest things that you discover about yourself is that you pick up on things quickly, and that people say that you're quick with words, and that you do things well. And because you couldn't play outside, because your skin would burn in the sun, that you would get second and third degree burns even if you were outside for an hour, then you discover books. You discover that you could read. You discover that there's all of this knowledge out there in the world that nobody in your community knew about, and that once you acquired it, you would feel yourself special. You would feel that you were better than other people, that they couldn't call you names, or they couldn't think of you as an aberration. And this goes on for years and years and years throughout your entire childhood, until one day at 15, your parents, who you haven't lived with at all, come to your village in the rural Philippine landscape of Bulacan and say, our petition for us to immigrate to the United States has been accepted, and we will be moving to Southern California in 2 months. So during a 2-month period, you transition from a rural Philippine landscape to Southern California, where all of a sudden there were these people who sort of kind of looked like you, but not quite. And you start getting mistaken for them, except that you have this thick Filipino accent that you have to get rid of, and you do get rid of it because you're good at adapting. You're good, and you start thinking, maybe I could belong. Maybe I could be part of this community. But over time, you realize that whoever you are, whatever you are, you're already too different that you could never truly belong anywhere. And so you start, once again, seeking solace in books, seeking solace in knowledge. And this particular quality allows you to get into the most prestigious schools, the most prestigious school in the country. You spend your college years at Harvard, and you spend your college years at Harvard excelling, being great, being amazing at things, and you begin to collect degrees. You're interested in the arts, so you have a degree in fine arts, specializing in photography, and you become interested in writing fiction. And so then you get accepted into Cornell as an MFA student in fiction. And then, but still, this is not enough. You don't know why. This doesn't satisfy you. You give up too easily. You don't know, you're confused. And then you decide to enter the PhD program in comparative literature. That would be impressive because you speak several languages, you have a talent for analysis, so this should be the path, this should be the way for you, and you will be a really fantastic professor, and everybody, you will think, you're so special and you're so great. And when it becomes time to study for your dissertation, to decide what your dissertation topic is, you say to yourself, well, people work in French and Spanish all the time, the two languages that you know. And I'm fluent in Tagalog, I know, but 100 million people speak that language. Why don't I work in a language that is extremely rare and that only 10,000 people speak up in the indigenous area of the Philippines, far, far north in Luzon, and study the poetry of those people, because that would be impressive. That would get me a job. That would get me all of the accolades that I want so that I can feel special, so that if you were me, you could feel the sense that finally you have a purpose in the world. And so you go there and you study their poetry and you study the relationship between their poetry and their landscape, and you make all of these amazing connections, and you think to yourself, wow, I'm really going to get an amazing job, and people are going to laud me because this kind of work has never been done before. And then you start actually looking at the poetry. And I was studying love poetry in Ifugao, and you know something about love in Ifugao? Love in Ifugao comes after work. The poems of the Ifugao people always emphasize that work is more important than love. There are poems about marriages breaking up because the couples can't share food. There are poems about people falling in love but having to do their farm labor first. And so you start asking questions. Why is this? Why is it that this poetry is all about labor when there's all of this romantic love that's supposed to be involved? And people tell you, well, it's always been really hard to make ends meet up here where we are, that a family can barely feed themselves, and that in the last 50 years, that people have began to abandon land that their families have inhabited for generations because they couldn't make ends meet. And that even more heartbreakingly, that families become separated, mothers leave their young children to be able to work as domestic workers in Hong Kong or the Middle East, to take care of other people's children, where the recruitment fees could be up to a year of their salary before they can actually make any money, and that they don't see their families for years and years. And then suddenly you come to this evaluation point. You think to yourself, well, there's all of this stuff is happening, and these mothers can't send their children to school, and you think to yourself, well, how much money has it taken to educate myself? Because you've been a scholarship kid ever since college. Your family is not rich. And you calculate, by the time you finish your PhD, it will be about 13, 14 years of schooling from undergrad to the end of your PhD at about $40,000 a year, rough figure. It would be about $500,000. A family of 5 people in the Philippines can easily live on $1,000 a year. So all of a sudden, you realize the 2,500 different individuals can feed themselves, can sustain themselves for an entire year just at the cost of what it took to educate for your own personal education. And so you think to yourself, well, this community has given so much to me. They've opened so much. They've given me all of this knowledge, which I can use to be able to get myself that amazing job. So why don't you try giving something back? Why don't you try doing something? And the most practical thing you've ever learned in your life is how to knit, is using 2 sticks and a ball of yarn. And you tell them, well, you start teaching them already, but you tell them, okay, I'm going to knit, I'm going to help you next year. I'm going to go back and research, and I'm going to bring needles, and I'm going to teach a group of people how to knit. And maybe that can lead to something that could be interesting. And so you go back the next year, and people are so eager, without any economic reason. They just want to learn. They just want to do something. They just want to have the possibility that their lives could actually improve. When I ask Manang Nancy, who's at the end of that picture, what she dreams of in her life, she said, any improvement, whatever improvement would do. And so you teach them how to knit, and they're so happy knitting, but then you realize that the secondhand clothing industry has completely overtaken this particular region so that people are no longer buying anything that has been made indigenously. The clothes that you're giving to Goodwill and Salvation Army, the surplus of those gets sent to these brokers who sell them by the ton to places like the Philippines. And that's how people in that region generally clothe themselves. So they couldn't actually sell any of the things that they make locally, and you figure this out. And so then you think, well, let's try to figure out what can the solution be? And then all of a sudden you say, well, you have to, maybe you can sell it on the internet or something. And oh, well, you need to be able to photograph them to be able for people to find them attractive. And oh, guess what? You happen to have a master's degree in photography that you acquired in order to feel special, to be able to be this great artist that everybody would say is really amazing and people would just absolutely love. And then you start photographing things that they've knitted, and all of a sudden you think, wow, this is a really, really amazing use of whatever talent you have. And then you go back to the States and you start telling stories to people about the Ifugao. And people start being convinced by your stories, and people start thinking and being affected by them. And you think to yourself, wow, this ability that I acquired of telling stories is actually proving really useful. And then you start making arguments. You start making points to be able to teach people, to be able to show people what it is that you're doing. And when people get convinced, all of a sudden, you think to yourself, wow, this skill that I acquired is suddenly proving useful. And then you run a successful Kickstarter campaign. You go back to Ifugao. You are able to employ 25 people for an entire summer through this fall. And then somewhere along the way, maybe sometime while you're just sitting there knitting with these amazing women, with all of these amazing stories, all of a sudden, you remember your grandmother. And you remember that feeling of belonging and connectedness. And all of a sudden, you realize that it's the same feeling. That throughout this entire time that you didn't have this feeling, what you needed to do was find a way to use your own talents to be able to get other people to keep their families together, to be able to get mothers to be able to suckle their own children, to be able to have communities stay intact and where they are. And so then in the States, people keep saying, what is going on with you? Wait, you started a business? You're a PhD student, for crying out loud. Why, your professor, one of your committee members says you keep putting on these different hats. And then you think to yourself, what is up with this hat thing? I don't think of it as putting on a different hat. I think of it as the same hat. I'm just using the skills at my disposal. So then you realize your professor is thinking maybe of those old 50s movie hats that Cary Grant or, I didn't grow up in America, but I would imagine Spencer Tracy wearing. But then, and then you think, oh, well, that's not my hat. This hat I'm wearing right now is a knitted hat. And the amazing thing, for those of you knitters out there, about a knitted hat is that you can always unravel it. You can always unravel its elements. You can refashion it. You can add new elements to it. You can shift it. You can change its size. You can change its shape. But it's still the same hat. It's not as though you're setting aside everything that you know and have learned in order to become a social innovator. It is that you're taking the skills that you already have and learning new skills in order to enable social and economic justice. We live in a rapidly changing world, a world where there's so many new opportunities, a world where there's so much more transparency. I know this because my own country has been ravaged, completely ravaged, last week. And even though it's so hard for me to see images from the Philippines right now, I take a peek. And in peeking, you're able to be reminded of why it is that social innovation is so incredibly important, and that it's our moral obligation to find ways to achieve social and economic justice in this world, and that there are new opportunities abounding, especially at a time when all of these institutions are shifting. The internet has enabled companies that are small, like ours, that have good stories, that have true stories, to be able to compete with large corporations that are only spinning stories that, while in fact hiding the women, the people who are making their products. And what I want to tell you is that if you're not doing something to make some sort of social change, today is the place to start. It's the time to start. And it doesn't have to be an amazing, huge 180-degree shift. For me, it was a pair of needles and a ball of yarn. For you, it could be something else. We need creative, innovative people. We need all of the brain power we can muster to be able to figure out how to make headway with all of the problems in the world. There are people out there that I've heard about who are thinking of making sustainable restaurants. There are people out there who are thinking of upcycling jeans and employing people who've been abandoned. There are all of these ideas, and we need ideas from all walks of life, from different people, from an anthropologist, from a marketer, from a brander. We need ideas from an architect. We need ideas from engineers. We need ideas from sociologists. We need ideas from all walks of life, because we know that the system that we're in, still, as hard as we try, isn't working. And you don't have to become a different person to make social change. You can keep your hat on to make a difference. And that, I hope, is an idea worth spreading. Thank you.